Back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Sumner Sambo. You may have heard for years that ancient Egypt was not a black African civilization, but European or Middle Eastern. My next guest does not think so. He has done thorough research to bring to light the true African imagery of the ancient Egyptians. Emmanuel Kulu is well known in Buffalo, New York for social work and his deep passion for creative arts. He tapped into film writing and acting with films like The Rise and Fall of Teflon End, Bug Love, and The First Purge. Kulu, who is a diasporan Cameroonian, believes African history has been misrepresented, whitewashed, and defaced due to Eurocentrism. He has faced several challenges in trying to restore the true history of ancient Africa. His new book, Black Pharaoh, Rise to Power, has caused racial controversy and even brought forth racist death threats and hate mail. Let's take a listen.
Conceptions that we talk about with African people. Let's just talk about some of them. Africans are primitive, uncivilized bushmen, live in nothing but mud huts. Even African greatness is always accredited to Arabs, Chinese, or even Europeans. Anybody other than Africans, anything great. North Africa is not considered black African at all, but European or Middle Eastern. Nothing great happened in Africa until European colonization. Blacks are not intellectual. We're only known for civil rights movements such as Dr. King and Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks are the most rendered of black history. It is argued that black people are more connected to monkeys than other human beings. These are the misconceptions. Europe influenced and civilized Africa. Okay? The only people who think that Africa was civilized is crazy Afrocentric black people. This is this misconceptions. Okay? So now we have to ask ourselves the question. After all of this proven dishonest scholarship from these archaeologists, are we going to continue to trust them?
All right, Emmanuel Kulu there. Well, I still have with me Dr. Obieze Kwesili. Well, I've been told that I just have to go to Emmanuel Kulu right now. So let's just talk about you, Emmanuel Kulu. It's good having you on the show. Let's talk about this book that you have written and what impact the book has had within the diaspora community in the US, and how should Africans receive this book?
Well, the book has been received very well. The reviews on Amazon are doing very good. When we had our first book signing, a lot of our book signings has been somewhat delayed due to COVID-19. But the reviews have been great. Everyone is appreciating the true African imagery of ancient Egypt finally coming to life with Black Pharaoh, Rise to Power. When I put this book out and I posted the book, just the cover, I received multiple death threats from and accused of blackwashing ancient Egypt, so to speak. But when you go to Egypt and you look at the tombs and you look at the mummies and you look at the hieroglyphs, you can look and Africans, when you look at these, you will see yourself in ancient Egypt, because these Egyptian people depicted themselves as black African people. Now, there were many archaeologists, such as Dr. Ben, such as Cheka Enti such as Ivan Van Sertima, who argued this, and they were quickly labeled as Afrocentric. Now, in this country that I live in here in America, the term Afrocentric is being extremely African and believe that everything is African, everything originated in Africa. And the opposite of that is what we call Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is basically the thought that everything originated from and derived, civilization-wise, derived from Europe, which we find in the studies of ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks, Aristotle or Herodotus or Marcellinus, they all conclude that the ancient Egyptians were black African people.
African scholars also, due to the influence of Western education, have had to fight scholars like you who try to promote such a notion. What kind of support are you receiving from people within the continent, and how much support have they been giving to you?
I've been getting a lot of support from the African diaspora. I've been getting a lot of support from many liberal movements that know this truth. I think the truth is known. I think it's just people that fear losing the modern day archaeology that has been taught and this ideology of Eurocentrism. I think that is what people fear the most, is losing what they've put out to the world and put into these curriculums. So if these things do come to pass, like books like Black Pharaoh start to get well known throughout the world, this would challenge the modern day curriculum that goes on in Africa, that goes on in the Americas. And this is some of the problems that we run into. But for the most part, the support of the book has been enormous. And we're working towards becoming a bestseller. So we just need everyone to continue to support the movement and to push it out there. The Black Pharaoh universe. We also have a show called The Culture Show here in Buffalo, New York, where we talk about the African diaspora every week, every Sunday, 6 p.m. Eastern time, just to raise the awareness of the great history that lied in ancient Benin, that lied in ancient Mali, that came from ancient Egypt, that came from ancient Kush, that came from the Examite kingdom, the Zulu kingdom, which I am a descendant of the Zulu. When you see the name Kulu, it is derived from the Bantu and Zulu tribe. So me having that origins from my father, I wanted to connect the African American side, which my mother is African American, and she was also an educator, and my African father, and be that bridge to bridge the gap between the African Americans and the Africans and restoring them back to the African diaspora.
It's sort of threats you had received when this book came out, and why those threats were targeted at you?
Well, the threats were targeted at me because the cover displays an African man as the Pharaoh of Egypt. And it's when you look at most of the books that you see, you see mostly a European or possibly a Middle Eastern Egyptian Pharaoh, but you never really see an African Pharaoh. And it's kind of interesting. Egypt is in Africa, even though it has been colonized by many different sects. I mean, you're talking about Greeks, you're talking about the Romans in the later years, you're talking about the Arab invasion in the 7th century. All of these different things happened way after the pharaonic periods. So after the collapse of the pharaohs. So basically, that is what caused a lot of hate. People felt that restoring something like that would throw their theories out the window, and they feared that. So that being said, that's where all the hate mail came, where people called me, "You blacks are slaves, and you have accomplished nothing to history. You have no history. You've done nothing remarkable." These were some of the emails and hate mail that I received, of things being said to me, the N-word, all types of things being said. Stop trying to steal history. All of these things, all basically from the simple fact that my cover displays an African man as an African pharaoh. And that was a problem for many people.
Now, and we also talk about some scholars who would prefer that you refer to ancient Egypt as being heterogeneous rather than homogeneous blacks. Now, Afro-Asiatic people who should be regarded as residing in Egypt rather than just Black Africans or Asians or Caucasians. What do you make of this demand by these scholars who would prefer to be in the middle?
Well, the thing is, again, this the fear of change. I think many scholars fear change and going against the grain, how you could be blacklisted and outcasted. As you look at the example of someone like Sheikh Enti who did thorough research and tested many ancient Egyptian mummies and concluded that the melanin levels were extremely high as any other part of Africa. So these proofs were facts, were buried. They were buried and they were debunked, so to speak, because of the Eurocentric agenda to whitewash, to Eurocentrinize ancient Africa. And then there's a term that we use in America that they use here called sub-Saharan Africa, which is below the Sahara. So that term came about in the 1950s that the UN came with to separate Northern Africa from Central, East, and West Africa. These were all tactics to take Egypt out of Africa and place Egypt into the Middle East, which is more connected to Europeans as well as the Mediterranean instead of Africa. So when you look at countries today like Morocco, Egypt, you will see that that's what's happened through colonization.
Talking about Mansa Musa, who was the richest man in the world, a lot of literatures seem to have been written, but it looks like we haven't heard so much of those people being celebrated. But we'll talk about this when we come back from the break. You're still watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead, including Emmanuel Kulu, the historian who has been raising awareness of the glorious ancient African history about his new novel, Black Pharaoh, Golden Age of Triumph. Stay with us. Come back to the Arise interview. And I still have with me Emmanuel Kulu, an African author and researcher, and we're still looking at Egyptology and the true story of Egypt based on his observation and research that ancient Egypt was actually made up of Black Africans and not Caucasians or Afro-Asians or Asians, as we have been reading. Back to the question I'd asked you earlier on, there's this attempt to actually silence some African leaders in the past, some top African rulers in the past and all of that. People like Mansa Musa, who had reigned in Timbuktu and all of that during the golden period of Mali. Just take us through efforts by authors like you to actually ensure that these ancient Africans are not buried with the present.
Yeah, some of the efforts that we make is I go around touring the United States, and I haven't been able to do much but through Zoom lately because of the pandemic. But we go around raising the awareness of ancient Mali, of ancient Egypt, of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was considered to be the richest man of the 13th and 14th century in the world. This is not just in Africa, in the world. His resources that he had in Africa with gold, everything that he had on his on his journey to Mecca, gave away billions of dollars in gold. And if we were compared the money for today, he gave away billions. So this man was very rich and very wealthy. And there's even studies based off Ivan van Sertima and others that Mansa Musa's brother, his predecessor, Abu Bakr II, would have sailed to the United States. And there's actually a lot of evidence of West African plants that were found in the not in the United States, but in South America, far before Columbus, before 1492, when Columbus came about. So there's great history that has to be talked about in regards to Africa and the discovery of America. So there's books out there by Ivan van Sertima in regards to the African presence of America that discuss this. I also discuss this in a lot of my seminars. We talk about Zululand, how Shaka Zulu was able to put together. We talk about the Exumite Kingdom. We talk about the Kushite Kingdom, Queen Imani Reyes, who held off the Romans from conquering ancient Kush. So there's so much great history that has been taken out of history that we know it today that needs to be reinserted. And how we can do this is to re-educate the educators. Africa is the beginning of all civilization. If we want to start with ancient Egypt, we can start there, but all the way down to the 14th century, 15th century is when we start to see the corruption of ancient antiquities of Africa. That's where we start to see the change, because the Romans and Greeks were not what we consider to be racist today. They gave a lot of credit to ancient Egypt for their science, for their mathematics, for the calendar, for the gods they worshipped. All of these things were accredited to ancient Egypt by the Greeks and the Romans. But we find it in the later periods, around the 1400 AD, that we start to see the corruption of Black history.
What's the relationship, according to your research findings, between Nubians based in Sudan, present-day Sudan, and the ancient Egyptians based in Egypt?
Well, these people were neighbors, so to speak, just like Cameroon and Nigeria are neighbors, just like the United States and Canada are neighbors. So it's the same thing. You had sometimes you may have had conflict. Sometimes you had peace between Nubia and Egyptians, but they considered themselves to be basically cousins that lived right next door from each other. So that being said, they shared a lot of traditions. What you would find in ancient Kush is there are more pyramids in ancient Kush than there are in Egypt. So you can see that there were a lot of mixing of culture between the two. And when you look at the Egyptian inscriptions, very similar to those in what we call Nubia today. So we know that there was an interchange of culture between the two, and very much all the way down into the Roman period as well. So, and still to this day, Sudan is considered now still a part of Black Africa. So they were not taken out of Sudan, or Nubia was not taken out of, was taken out of that sub-Saharan term and, placed with the rest of Africa, so to speak.
How important is the study of Egyptology to modern-day Africans, and why should they invest their resources into going into that very significant past based on what we've seen, which looks like a deliberate attempt to corrupt history by some scholars?
Well, because ancient Egypt is the monarch of ancient antiquity studies. And this was an African civilization. This was something that belonged to Africa, that has been taken from Africans. Now, ancient Egyptians didn't just stay in Egypt forever. They traveled to Central Africa. We know they traveled into Eastern Africa and possibly Western Africa. As we see many different interchanges with even the ancient Mali culture with ancient Egypt. There were many Egyptians who, due to the land being overproduced by the Greeks and the Romans, when they came into power, many Egyptian people went south, down into places like Benin, down into places like Cameroon, down into Central Africa, down into South Africa, down into what we call modern day Ethiopia and Somalia today. So these Egyptian people traveled far before Columbus or any type of European travelers. So what they call today explorers. So these ancient Egyptian people are the cornerstone of civilization to Africa. So to separate Egypt from Africa is to take credit to the contribution that Africa has on history. So we must reclaim that history in order to restore the glorious history of Africa.
Knowing how African Americans, including Africans in the diaspora too, have been receiving your book, how has the reception been like?
The reception has been great, to reconnect with their African roots. You know, as I mentioned earlier on the show, my mother is African American and my father is from Cameroon. So to have that, to have both sides, to have the African American side who were taken into slavery, and to have the African side that were kings and queens and know our history. To have both of that, I share the pain and the joy of both. And I'm able to relate that to many African American brothers and sisters in regards to their glorious history that has been stripped from them. Now, when they were brought in America, their heritage of kings and queens were taken from African Americans. So when they hear my seminars or where they purchase the book, they're able to reclaim this great history that has been taken from them for 400 years and start to identify with Africa. With a lot of African Americans, the problem that they run into is, what part of Africa do I claim? I don't know what part of Africa I was taken from, or so to speak. And I tell them all the time, you can claim any part of Africa that you want because you were taken from Africa when you don't know, but you do know that you're an African. You do know that. So reclaim that, reclaim your glory. Remember that your ancestors are kings and queens, rulers. The first women to ever rule on the planet were African women doing remarkable things. Queen Imani Reyes, we can talk about Hatshepsut, we can talk about Queen Nandi, we can talk about Yashantue. We can go on and on these great women, the Queen of Sheba, Hatshepsut, Queen Tiye. We can go on and on these African queens who did remarkable things. And when we look at how African women have been treated throughout the world, it's the lack of knowledge of understanding who we were in our past.
The part where you have all of these women ruling their dynasties, monarchies, and all of that. Just talk to us very quickly as we try to round off your discovery that you're from a royal family and how that drove you into this research.
Yeah, my father was, when he came to this country back in the mid 70s, he played for the national Cameroon team, the Indomitable Lions. And his goal was to get a better education here in America and also to play football as well with his teams that he played with here in the United States. But his goal was to start a family and also to raise the awareness. And what my father did is no matter what country you were from, if you were an African, you were his brother. And everyone who came into our home, we called them Uncle John, Uncle Bob, or whoever they was. If they were African, it didn't matter what country you were from. And what we see today, even in many African countries, is that divide between many countries. And we have to remember that these borders have been placed on Africa from the Council of Berlin. These borders didn't exist before. So Cameroon wasn't separated from Nigeria. Egypt wasn't separated from Sudan, so to speak. These borders were man-made and created way later, after our great civilizations collapsed. So my father taught me all these things. And my mother, my African mother, Betty Kulu, she was a historian and an English teacher who also taught me about the great African history that we have. And she always told me, son, you have a special thing inside you because you have your African side and then you have your African American side in which you can relate to both and bring the African diaspora together. And that's my goal through my family structure, how I was raised, to raise that attention of our glorious history and give it to both sides, the African diaspora who know their history and the African American who are just coming into knowledge of their history.
All right. Just very quickly, what do you think Kamala Harris' emergence means? Just 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm. Well, I try to stay away from politics, so to speak.